Hi, this is Phil. Welcome to another video. In this one I'm going to show you how I've done the smoke effect. So let's have a quick look at that in the game itself. So as I shoot a ground enemy, you see it starts emitting this smoke effect. And same for the laser. So basically any ground enemies will emit the smoke. Same with the boss ship. Once that starts taking on damage, it starts emitting smoke. Now, the only difference between what I'm doing with the ground enemies and the boss ships, the ground enemies only have one smoke emitter, but the boss ship, as it gets more damaged, more smoke emitters are added, and it's basically done in 20% steps. So for a boss ship, you can see there now that it's emitting more smoke, so it's got a couple of emitters on there. I think that might actually have 3 actually, but it'll have up to 5. Obviously once it's 100% damaged, it's destroyed, so every 20% on them. Also on something to mention, as these particles are coming off and as they're aging and dying off, when an enemy is destroyed, it doesn't remove all the particles, it lets them carry on and lets them die off, and then the smoke emitter is removed from the game once all the particles have died off. So you might not be able to see this when this gets destroyed, but it'd look a bit odd if all the particles disappeared when the game object was removed. So I'll show you how I've got it to do that as well. So let's have a look. Let's make this code larger. So you also see that we're using the new Atom. We're using Atom now in AOZ Studio, and I've grown to like it quite a lot than Visual Studio Code. It's quite easy to use, and we've got a nice syntax highlighting going on now as well. Makes coding a lot nicer, a lot easier. So if you saw my previous video on the explosion particle effects, you saw how I set that up with using arrays and multidimensional arrays. So I'm basically doing the same thing, but because the key difference is that in the explosion particle effect I was using pixels, and actually I've updated this to use the bar command so that I can have larger particles rather than just having a 1 pixel by 1 pixel particle. But yeah, the key difference here is that for the smoke I'm using images for each individual particle. So I'll just show you those images, get an idea. Let's have a look. Hopefully you can see them 4 images there, and so they've got different shapes, and obviously there's a darker shade there than this one, and they are the 4 images that each particle uses, and these are basically getting rotated and scaled, and also an alpha value applied so that they fade out as they get older, so give that visual effect of the smoke dissipating. So they're the 4 images. So let's start with the variables. So the first one is max smoke systems. That just controls how many smoke systems I can have in the game. I've only got that set to 10, but you could easily add, up that to whatever you wanted. The smoke particles is the number of individual particles per smoke system. So 50 is more than enough for what I'm using. You can see that the plume of smoke is quite short, and it's probably not even using more than 10, but because the procedure for adding the smoke system, you can control how long you want that plume. Obviously the longer it is, the more particles it'll need. So I've just left that around 50 just in case later on in the game I decide to have smoke that's longer. So here are the arrays for the smoke system. So we've got the status. If you see my previous videos, you know this is the sort of technique I use. A 0 means that it's not in use, and a 1 means it's in use in the game. And the next couple are just the X and Y positions of the smoke system. The Vy is the velocity in the Y direction. And the trigger and age are used together. So the age, this basically gets incremented at each frame, and when the age reaches the value of what's in the trigger, the system will add a new particle to itself and resets the age back to 0. So it's just a way of triggering new particles to be added to the system. And the next one is for the particle. For each particle, it gets set a max age, so it knows when it's got to die off and be removed. So that's what that's for. And the max length and the min length for each particle, that basically controls the shape of how the particles get emitted. And so I'll show you that in a bit more detail in the draw code. It'd be easier to explain in there so you can see what's going on. But it's just a way to give that shape, sort of this from the small, because the particles start off small and then they grow larger. So this is a way just to restrict how big and how small they start and end up. So we'll move on to the individual particle arrays. So again, these are multidimensional, and again you've got a status, so a 0 and a 1, live or not. The bob, so this is which bob number to use. As you know, when you use the bob command, you've got to use bob numbers, and each individual particle gets assigned a bob number that it's going to use when it's being drawn on screen. You might be wondering how I know what bob numbers to use. So if we just scroll back up here, I've got an array here that's sized at 1000, and these are basically, I'm calling it a bob pool. So what will happen is initially all these 1000 elements in this array will all be set to 0. When a new particle is added, I basically look through this array for any that's 0, and once I find one, I'll set that to 1 to say that it's in use, and then I'll set this array value to whatever value that was, plus the offset. So if I start at position 0 and it's free, meaning it's a 0, I'll add this 1000 to that, which will give me 1000, and I'll start 1000 in here. So in the draw code, when I'm using the bob command, I just use whatever value is stored in there. And then obviously when the particle dies, it has to go back in here and free that bob number up so that it can be reused. So it just cycles them within there. So I've got this as a variable, the offset, because you might want to change that. You might want to start it at 5000 just to keep it away from all the other bobs that are being used in the game. So that's how I'm managing the bob numbers. So just a couple more variables in here. You've got the age of the particle, and that in together with what the max age was set on the system is what's used to remove these. So once the age reaches this max age, it then gets removed. And also in the draw code, these are used to control the alpha. So when when it's a brand new particle. So when the age is 0, it'll have a lower or higher alpha value. It'll have a less see-through alpha than what it'll end up with, and so that allows it to fade over time. And then you've just got the X and Y for each individual particle, and then the image that gets allocated to that, and that'll be randomly generated from the 4 images that we're using. So it gets allocated an image when a new particle gets added to the system, and it uses that same image, but it gets rotated and alphaed as it gets older. I'll show you where all that's done. And I've just made them all global just because they're used in procedures. So you need to do that to make them available in there. So that's all the variables that I'm using for the smoke particle system. So let's have a look at it. We'll have a start at the procedure that's doing the add. So we've got the add smoke system here, and we're taking in an X and Y position, and the velocity Y, and the trigger and the max particle age are also added as an input parameter. And then we've got them 2 max and min particle lengths that I talked about earlier, which I'll show you in the draw code. So again, this particle trigger controls when a new particle is added into the system, and all this add smoke system does is basically loop around the smoke system status array to find one that's not in use. Once it finds one, it sets it to a 1 so that it don't get used again, and sets the X and Y position. Now when this is getting called, the X includes the position of where we are in the level map. So this is why I'm taking off whatever the value of level X is to get the screen position, and that's why I'm doing that there. As you can see, I'm just setting the velocity, setting the particle trigger, defaulting the age data 0 for the particle system there, and then I'm just adding these other input parameters. So just setting everything up for the system there, and then I exit out of the for loop once I've found one and added that. So a key thing here is you'll see there that I'm returning an output parameter there, and I'm returning whatever index was found, or which one was chosen to use. And that's important later on in the game, because this X and Y position, let's say we've added this to the boss ship, and obviously the boss ship is moving around. So as that ship moves around, it needs to be able to update these values. So I'll show you that in the player ship move code. It has to check if there's a smoke system being added, and if it has, then it obviously needs to update this, but it needs to know which index to update. So when it's added, it gets this return value and it stores that in a variable that's related to the actual boss ship, and it's the same for the ground enemies as well. So that's why that's being returned. So the next procedure does what it says on the tin, just removes that smoke system from the game. So again, it's just setting the status to 0 for the system, and then it has to loop through all the particles and do the same, set its status to 0, and also remove the bob from the screen. And again, as I said earlier, it's using whatever bob numbers being stored in that array there, and then it also sets the status of the bob pool array back to 0. so that can be recycled and reused. So that's all that's doing. You can see there I'm using that bob offset just to minus that off the actual bob number that was stored, because this array is 0 based. So bob 1000, we take 1000 off, and that would be element 0 in there. So let's have a look at the update smoke. So again, this update smoke, and below that we've got draw smoke. They're getting called in every game loop, and so for every frame basically it's doing this. So the first thing it does, we're going to start looping around all the smoke systems, checking the smoke system status, which is there. So if it's greater than 0, means it's in use. We need to do something with it. First thing it does is it'll add to the age of that, so increase the age, and it does that using the delta time. And so the next thing it's going to do is check to see if it needs to add a new particle into the system. So based on the age, if it's higher than, or if it's greater than or equal to what we said the trigger is, and also checking to see if this smoke system status is 1. And the reason I'm doing that is because if you remember when I said when we want to remove the game object from the game, we don't want to remove all the particles, but we want to stop adding particles. So what we do elsewhere in the game, when a ground enemy is destroyed, we set the smoke system status to a number 2. So that'll stop new particles being added into the system, just because we've got this smoke system status equals 1 there. And later on in the code I'll show you that there's an extra piece of code there that'll check if it's at status 2, and once there's no more particles left, it'll then remove it'll set the smoke system status back to 0 to free that up so it can be reused. So once it's stripped into here, it sets the age back to 0, so it'll set that timer going again, and then we need to add a new particle. So the first thing it'll do is loop around the particle status array. Once it's found one that's free, it'll set that to a 1 so that it can't be used, and then set the age of this particular particle to 0. And so what it'll do then is it'll set the particle X and Y position to whatever we said the X and Y was here, to whatever value we stored in there, but also give a bit of randomness to that. So plus or minus 8 pixels there, just to give it a bit of randomness, so the particles aren't coming from the same point. Just makes it look a little bit more natural. And then this is where we're randomly selecting one of the 4 images and storing that as well. Like I said, to put this particle on screen we need a bob that's not in use. So this is just going to loop around that array that we spoke about, find one that's free, and then we'll change that to a 1 so that it don't get used again, and then set the value plus the bob offset, whatever B was plus the bob offset, and store that in there so that when we come to draw that we know which bob number to use. You can see where we're using the bob offset there, because we're starting at 0. We need to add that 1000 to get the correct bob number that we're going to use. Then we exit the for loop there, so that's taking care of adding new particles into the system. The next bit of code looks after moving the particles. So we're just because we want to know if all the particles have died off or not, so that we can remove the system. when we set 1 to a 2. So we've just got a variable there that's going to tell us if there's any particles, if we've updated any particles, so any live particles basically. So we're going to loop through them all. When we find one that's a 1, we're going to increment that counter, then also increment the age of the particle, and then this is where we're going to add the y velocity to the individual particle, which is there. We're just using the delta time there so that it's frame rate independent. And then the X position, because the map is scrolling to the left and we want to make sure that the plume is vertical, we use the map speed there just to take that off the X position as well. If we didn't do that, the smoke would project off to the right because it looked like the ground was moving underneath it. But obviously in the game, it's, even though it's scrolling to the left, it's not the map that's moving, it's the, it's the camera that's keeping up with, or the camera's moving to the right to go along with the terrain. But yeah, if you had a game that's that you didn't need, that you want a horizontal scroll, you probably won't need this line. And the next bit of code, so this is looking at removing expired particles. So based on the max age that we set when we called the add procedure, it looks at the age. If it's greater than that max age, it basically removes that bob from the screen, frees the bob up in the bob pool, and then set this particular particle status to 0, so that can be reused as well. So again, just recycling those. So if we've got to the end of here and the smoke particle is 0, which basically means we've not dropped into here, we've not updated any particles because they're all 0s. But the smoke system is a 2. Then we call the remove smoke system procedure that we went through up here, and that'll just clear that one up and remove that out of the game and free it up to be reused. So that's how that's done. So in the draw smoke, again, we're just looping around all the smoke systems, checking the status. If the status is greater than 0, so if it's a 1 or a 2, it's going to draw them. And once it's found one that's greater than 0, it'll then loop round all the individual particles, and for any that are set to 1, first thing it'll do is put the bob on screen. So again, this is where it gets the bob number from that value that we've stored in there from the bob pool. And we've got the X and Y position there, and then whatever image was randomly selected and stored in there. So that puts the bob on screen. And then the next bit, what we're doing here is working out how old the particle is to determine how much alpha to apply to it. So you can see here the max age and the particle age there. We're doing a division on that so we can see the sort of the percentage of the age regarding the max age, and we're just doing a 1 minus from that so that we get a value we can use to apply the alpha. So this will be a value obviously less than 1 depending on the age of the particle, and what we're doing then is clamping whatever value this results in to be between a maximum of 0.3 and a minimum of 0.01. I just played around with these. I think I had this set a bit higher, but the smoke didn't look quite right, so I just played around with that until I got it to look how I wanted it. That's what that's doing. And then the scale, so the particles start off small, and as they get older they grow, but they only want to grow to a certain size as they age. So this is where the max length is used to work that out, and that's all based on the age as well. So this basically gives you the bob scale as it gets older, but it also limits how large it can get. So it controls the spray of it, if you like, and how fast it grows to its maximum size, which are all based on those parameters that are given to the add procedure. So once we've got the scale, we then use the bob scale command to set the scale of the bob for the particle, and we're using the same value for the x and y, as you can see there. And then we also rotate the particle at a random rotation there. So there we have the draw. So these bits of code just look after adding and drawing and removing the particles from the screen. So we have a look at where we do that. So have a look at the player bullet collision code, which is here. So this is where we're using bob call to check each bullet against the ground enemies. The enemy ships are in a separate part of this code, but this is just for ground enemies. So you can see here it's looking through, and this is basically the bit that determines that the ground enemy has received enough hits to be destroyed, and it's then getting removed here, an explosion, and if it's got a collectible it'll add one there. So further down in this code, we're basically having a look here to see if this ground enemy has smoke variable set to 1, and if it has, that means there's a possibility that this one has got a smoke emitter attached to it. If it has indeed got one, it will initially check to see if it hasn't already got one. So this is the smoke index. So this is the index that gets returned from the add smoke procedure. So that gets defaulted to -1. And if it is -1, meaning that it hasn't got one, it will then call the procedure to add one. So as you can see, these GE variables stand for ground enemy, or they're short for ground enemy, and we're adding in the X and the Y of the ground enemy, plus any offset that's been assigned as well. So in the ground enemy variables, we might want to position the smoke a bit more accurate or differently to what the X and Y is. So that's why these are getting added as well. And then we've got the rest of the parameters. As you can see there, that the velocity Y is set to -200, so that's the speed going up. And then you've got the trigger, the max age, and then the length, min and max there. So they're the values that I've used to get the right effect that I was looking for. And then as you can see, this is the return parameter coming back, so that's the index that was used in the smoke system, and I'm storing that in a ground enemy variable there. And I basically do the same for the enemy ships. It's a little bit different for the enemy ship because the boss ship you can have up to 5, whereas for ground enemies I'm only dealing with 1, and that's why I've only got a ground enemy smoke index, just a single dimensional array there. If we look at the enemy ships, you can see when I'm storing the enemy smoke index, or the smoke index system there, it's a multi-dimensional array, and I can add up to 5 for a boss ship. So quickly to go through this, it's the same technique. Enemy ship has smoke. If it has, I'm checking to see if, well, for each of the available smoke indexes there, I'm looping through those just to check if there's any that, if it's a -1, meaning that we can put one on there, and once it's found one that's free, we then check based on the enemy's kill points and how many hits it's had. It'll work out what percentage that is, and if it's less than 20 times the SI, so the 0 to far, that'll give me the right percentage, or the right trigger to give me that 20 by every 20% to add a new system. So what we're doing here is on the enemy ship smoke X offset, we're adding a random value just so we don't add them to the same position each time, and then we're just calling the add smoke system in the same way as what we did for ground enemies, and again it's added there into the multi-dimensional. So just to show you why these are being stored, if we'll find the code that moves, draw enemies, I think. Yeah, so this is the update enemy ships code. And this is looping around all the enemies and looking after updating them based on the type of AI they have. It also looks after shooting. And at the bottom of there, another thing it's doing now is this piece of code. So it first checks to see if that particular enemy ship has smoke. Now, currently it's only the boss ships, but all the other ships get destroyed too quickly for them to be added to that, so that's why it's only on the boss ships. And then it loops around the 4 possible smoke emitters or smoke systems and checks the index. And if we've added one, the index would be greater than 0, so that's why we've got this. And then all we're doing then is the original smoke system X and Y, we're just updating those, so when new particles are added, they get added to this new value here, and this new value is basically the enemy ship X position plus any offset that we added as well when we added the enemy ship. And as you can see, it's using here the index that was stored when the system was added, or when the add procedure was called, it returned this index. So this is how we're getting to reference the correct smoke system, because we had that stored in there, so we know which one gets updated. So that's how we keep the smoke system with the enemy ship, and it's a similar thing for the ground enemies. And just one other thing to cover is when did we not cover this? I'll just have another quick review on the player bullets. I think I might have skipped over it, but yeah, I think I skipped over it. So this is where a ground enemy is getting removed because it's been destroyed. I don't think I showed you this, but all we're doing here is checking if it has smoke, and if the smoke index is greater than 0, this is where we're setting the smoke system status to a 2, using the index that was stored when we added the smoke system there. And as you know, as we saw in the update code for the smoke system, when it comes across any that's a 2, it'll wait until all the particles have gone before it removes that from the game completely. Okay, hopefully this has been helpful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.